Okay, so now we're going to talk about roles in a usability study. So this is kind of like a little bit of repetition. So there are three roles in a usability study. The user, obviously you all know what who a user is. There is a facilitator, and then there are observers. So the facilitator is obviously the leader of the user study who is doing the briefing, who is asking questions from the user and is giving user tasks to do. And one very important detail that you need to keep in mind is that the facilitator's role is to prod the user to think aloud. They ask questions from the user. If they notice some interesting behavior, they will try to ask those questions right away. And then they have to be the representative of the development team. So the development team might have some questions that they want the facilitator to ask from the user. So the users, so the facilitator is the bridge between development team and the user. And then, of course, we have the observers. The observers are taking a lot of notes. They're staying quiet. They're looking for movements that strongly affect usability, either in task performance or user satisfaction. And this is what they're able to do. And they're able to determine these details by closely monitoring users' expressions. So that's why they need to put a camera on that's recording users' expression, because they are trying to see where the user is satisfied and where they are not. All right, and they are looking for some critical events, so the critical incidents. The critical incidents are usually negatives, or they can also be pleasant surprises. So whenever they notice something, a reaction from the user, whether it's a positive reaction or a negative reaction, the observer are going to quickly note it down. So when, for example, if a user is completed a task and they're like, oh, that was easy, this is a critical incident that needs to be recorded and reported. Or if the user just finished a task and they're saying this was so difficult, this is a critical incident, so they need to record this information. Okay, so now I'm just going to give you cover this usability testing that's covered in your book. So the iPad was, as you all know, was first released in 2010. So the Apple was trying to do some usability testing on iPad before it was going to be released, because they wanted to put some information out to the developers, because they were interested in having third-party developers make some apps so that iPad could be more attractive for users to buy. But they needed to convince the developers that this is a good platform to develop apps for. So they had to give some sort of information to this user group. So what they did was they hired a company to conduct some usability studies, and they ended up finding 7 participants over a course of 3 months who had experience with iPhones. And just as I described, their process was that they started off with asking the user to sign an informed consent form. When I talked about informed consent, I didn't really tell you that you need to get a paper form signed. So informed can either be verbal or paper based. So if there are certain very detailed informations, then you need to put it in paper. So for example, in this case, they wanted the users to keep the information about this study private, not because they wanted this study to be done secretly. So for these reasons, they had to kind of get the signed consent from the user that it was kind of an agreement between the user and the evaluator that the study details will remain secret. So basically they first asked the user to explore the iPad on their own. Next, they assigned some random tasks to the user. So as you can see, these are some of the tasks they ask the user to perform. So they ask the user to either use an app or a website on iPad and then do a certain task with it. Yeah, so they ended up doing 6 tasks, and then they recorded how users are interacting with the iPad, and these are some of the problems they detected. Okay, these problems are detected by making their notes, observational notes. So the accessing the web was difficult, lack of affordance and feedback, getting lost in an application, knowing where to tap. So these are some of the problems that they observed. And then the evaluators reported these problems to the developers and also made it public on a on a website. So based on these problems that they noticed, they came up with some recommendations. So this is very important. When you prepare a usability report, the goal of preparing a report is to come up with some recommendations. So based on their study, they came up with these recommendations. They said the accessibility for all types of users is very important. Okay, and then in the recommendation, they also kind of make some future recommendations. So they recommended that because the study did not address how iPad would be used in everyday lives, so they recommended that another study be conducted in the future to figure out what those issues are going to be. And then that another study was conducted a year later. So these are some examples of usability tests. I know you have all watched a lot of them. I'll still post them. If you want to look at them, you can look at them again.